The late 1950s and early 1960s saw the rapid and largely peaceful decolonisation of much of Africa. New independent nation states emerged in place of Britain and France's colonies on the continent. Portugal, a dictatorship during this period, however, resisted peaceful decolonisation, forcing African nationalists to take up arms to achieve independence. The United States, itself of course a former colony of Britain, generally supported rapid decolonisation, but it worried that radical African nationalism might open the door to communism in the midst of the Cold War. The Soviet Union, whilst never directly challenging Western influence on the continent, did provide military aid and assistance to African nationalists in the Portuguese colonies like Angola, in the racist settler regime of Rhodesia, and in apartheid South Africa. In 1969, Henry Kissinger commissioned a study on US policy in Southern Africa, and the resulting document, National Security Study Memorandum No. 39, can be accessed online. NSSM 39 gave Kissinger a range of options for future American policy, and it was Kissinger who selected option 2. And in the report, the recommendation read as follows: "The whites are here to stay, and the only way that constructive change can come about is through them. There is no hope for the blacks to gain the political rights they seek through violence, which can only lead to chaos and political opportunities for the communists." By this decision, by Kissinger's adoption of this option, the United States reduced pressure on Portugal and Rhodesia in South Africa, refusing, for example, to impose trade and defence sanctions, and indeed cooperating with Portugal in NATO and taking advantage of its strategic base in the Azores. This decision confirmed for many African nationalists that America was not a country offering liberty, but instead a brutal imperial power. US policy in Vietnam, American involvement in Vietnam confirmed this view for many of them. An American defeat in Vietnam, from where its troops finally withdrew in 1973, also reduced American prestige. But was option 2 the right one for America? Certainly, African nationalists were unable to overthrow Portuguese rule in the colonies through military means. But the social and economic burden that the colonial wars placed on Portugal led in April 1974 to the Carnation Revolution, actually a coup by junior army officers that placed Portugal on the road to democracy and its colonies on a short road to independence. Now, fighting guerrilla wars from exile, as the Angolan nationalists had done, had encouraged divisions between 3 different African nationalist movements, each of which was more dependent on external assistance than internal support. Now, as the Portuguese planned their withdrawal, these movements moved into Angola and fought what amounted to a civil war for future control of the country. Each received backing to a greater or lesser extent from the superpowers. The United States and South Africa provided secret military aid to 2 of the movements, the FNLA and UNITA. But an incoherence, a hesitation in American policy, in the wake of the failure of option 2 of NSSM 39, meant that America was hesitant about its support, and in the wake of Vietnam, it was reluctant to become involved in a further overseas war, expensive and unpopular at home. American caution, American hesitation made the Soviet Union more confident, and it quickly provided large-scale military aid, particularly including rocket launchers, to the MPLA. The MPLA was only able to benefit from the supply of these weapons because the Soviet Union's Caribbean ally, Cuba, was willing to put troops on the ground in Angola in alliance with the MPLA. And although those troops only arrived in late 1975, they were really important to enabling the MPLA to win its ultimate victory for control of Angola. In the war's strategic battle in Kifangondo in November 1975, MPLA troops fought alongside Cuban soldiers and Soviet advisors. On the other side, the FNLA had the support of CIA advisors. So here, the Cold War had truly arrived in Africa. And it was with the MPLA's victory that the real failure of Kissinger's decision in 1969 can really be understood. America's policy had been about preventing communism coming in Africa, but by alienating Angolan nationalists, by pushing them towards the Soviet Union, and by failing to directly challenge the MPLA's push for power, The unintentional result, in part, of American policy was to bring about sub-Saharan Africa's first fully fledged communist state. Ordinary Angolans had little or no say in the outcome of the war, and they also paid a heavy price for turning their war of national liberation into a local battle in the global Cold War. Over the next 15 years, Angola was the terrain of battles between the Soviet-backed government, Cuban forces, and on the other side, rebels supported by South Africa, America, and the West. 500,000 people were killed, and more than 1 million people became internal refugees. And you might like to consider the nature of the MPLA's alliance with the Soviet bloc. Were its leaders ideological Marxists trying to achieve communism in Africa, or were they in some ways opportunists engaged in what we might call a marriage of convenience with the Soviet Union to acquire weaponry and other forms of aid? Is this a story of superpower manipulation of weak African puppets? Or was it in fact the African liberation movements that were pulling the strings, using the language of the Cold War to persuade reluctant superpowers to provide aid and weaponry to achieve national independence? And finally, given the long-term suffering of ordinary Angolans that resulted, was bringing the Cold War to Africa a price that was worth paying?